Southwark Crown Court in London over the past 2.5 weeks has seen the case of 5 Just Stop Oil activists who were convicted for conspiring to cause gridlock on the M25 back in November 2022. As part of his role as UN Rapporteur for Environmental Defenders, Michael Forst was watching the proceedings and he was somewhat taken aback, to put it mildly. Let's talk about this with Green Party peer Baroness Natalie Bennett. Good evening, Natalie.
Evening, lovely to be with you.
Well, thanks for being here. What did you make of this Southern Crown Court proceedings?
Well, I think the fact that this has attracted the attention of the UN Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders and the context in which this is happening, in which we're being told that the prisons are on the point of collapse, and yet we're looking at a situation where we're being told that non-violent, peaceful protesters exercising what should be their democratic rights could be facing long jail terms. This really is an indefensible situation, and it really highlights the repressive legislation that was brought in by the former government that we very much hope will be working to see repealed as soon as possible.
I mean, part of the case was that these 5 individuals caused disruption. Is it not a bit difficult to protest publicly without causing disruption? Isn't disruption really part of the point?
The point, of course, is getting attention, and that means disruption. There's also some utterly indefensible measures I spent quite a bit of time in the House of Lords arguing against about making noise. And, making noise is something that people from all kinds of sides of politics are concerned about, all sorts of issues. And, it doesn't matter whether you agree with them or not. This is something that's always been part of our political process. And if you look at, say, some recent examples, the anti-fracking protests, which were eventually seen to be on the right side of history, you might say. Also in Sheffield, the protests trying to protect street trees, which ultimately were shown to be entirely in the right and to be having seen the officialdom entirely in the wrong. So many times these have been essential measures for our democracy.
And the prosecution said that the disruption that was caused by these 5 people who are on trial amounted to £750,000 of economic damage and £1 million policing costs. But if even the most mild predictions of climate scientists come true, then what we're going to be faced is disruption which is going to make that seem like a drop in the ocean, isn't it?
Absolutely right. And one of the things that I think was particularly disturbing about the court case last week is that we've seen a number of recent court cases where climate and other environmental protesters have actually been acquitted by juries. And that jury system is the very foundation of our system. And those juries have heard about the climate emergency, the reasons behind the actions of the protesters, and they've chosen to acquit. And now we've got to the stage where juries are being told they're not even allowed to hear such explanations any further, which really is a deeply disturbing development.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, really, that you're quite right that previous to this case that certain demonstrators have been put on trial and then explained the reason for them taking the action that got them there. And a jury has quite rightly taken that on board and thought that perhaps that it was entirely justified, their actions. But why do you think the judge refused to allow them to even explain why they took the actions to protest in the first place?
Well, I wasn't in the courtroom, and I wouldn't really focus particularly on the actions of an individual judge. What I'd rather focus on the fact is that we have 2 pieces of legislation, the 2 most recent repressive pieces of legislation, anti-protest legislation, that need to be repealed. The courts have been directed by the former government, the Conservative government, to crack down on protest. It's at the time the Labour Party said it was opposed to that. The Labour Party is now in power and has the capacity to act to change the law, which will then have to change the action of the judges.
Yeah, it's something of a coincidence, perhaps, that the Tories accepted about £8.5 million from oil and gas interests and polluting industries and individuals who supported climate change science denial for whatever reason. Since 2019, the Conservative Party and its MPs received 80 times more polluting cash than the Liberal Democrats and 160 times more than Labour. So with the taking out that inducement to go along with the fossil fuel industry of cash, do you have hopes that the Labour Party is going to change course in this direction?
Groups, although I think that's part of a much broader problem of the place of big money in our politics. Democracy, it would be a good idea, but while ever organisations like gambling companies, like developers, like the financial sector, can donate large amounts of money or indeed donations in kind in terms of consultancy firms donating members of their staff to make Labour Party policy, well, whenever we have that situation, then we don't really have a democracy. I mean, in the elections bill Now Act, which had many negative sides, I put down an amendment to say that no one should be able to donate more than £1,000 a year to any political party, side or campaign. I didn't get much support for that, but I think we won't have a democracy until we get the big money out of it. We get the politics the few people pay for.
And the UN rapporteur for environmental defenders, he did make the point that we're not the only country that is actually persecuting people who are bringing climate change to the attention of the public, but we are by far the most severe of the countries that are undertaking this action by dint of the punishments that are being handed out. Why do you think that is?
I think that was a sense of desperation. I mean, I could feel this myself in the chamber. The previous government felt like it was losing control. It was losing the argument. The reality of the climate emergency is sadly all too evident. We're seeing extreme weather events, wildfires, droughts, floods right around the world now as we speak. We've had our farmers here in the UK very strongly affected by climate change-related weather conditions that have affected their crops, affected their incomes, are a real issue for our food security. So as it became more and more obvious, there was more and more desperation, I think, to try and to crack down on those who were delivering the message.
Do you think we're in a sort of area like we used to be with the cigarette companies, that they knew that their products were actually harming and killing people, but they pretended that that wasn't the case?
Well, there's evidence that going back many decades, some of the world's largest fossil fuel companies or oil and gas companies were actually very much aware of the climate emergency, were aware of the fact that climate change was on the way, was speeding up, and did their utmost to actually hide that fact. And I think it's interesting that on the other side of this, we're actually seeing more and more organisations like Client Earth, for example, that are using the law, more and more cases to actually demand action and to demand recompense. So that's something that's going to have a very real impact on those companies. And I mean, we've recently seen in International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea came out with a ruling saying that there is a legal responsibility to protect the oceans from the impact of climate change. So we're seeing two within the legal system, two forces pointing in very opposite directions. And I think it's very clear, just because of the facts on the ground, which one is going to have to eventually win.
You mentioned extreme weather events, but barely a week goes by where there isn't some extraordinary footage of floods or drought or storms and tornadoes and so on that are all over the news. And yet people see that, and there's still this enormous pushback about the concept of net zero. Why do you think that is?
I think all of the surveys show that there is actually massive public support for climate action. There's a small, noisy minority of people who have special interests, have financial interests, but there's also a significant number of people, I understand why, who are already in extremely difficult financial situations, the cost of living crisis. People are already struggling to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. What I'm concerned with is not individual action, but changing the system so that the environmentally friendly thing to do is the easiest, cheapest and simplest. cheapest. And has to be the direction of travel, focusing on that system change. But people do feel like, well, I'm driving my car because there is no bus. And maybe they might feel like that makes them feel guilty, but they shouldn't. The problem lies with the system that's not providing the good, reliable bus services, the safe, convenient ways to get around with active transport, walking and cycling, all the things that we should have been doing for decades that would make people's lives better and tackle the climate emergency. But of course, it's very hard to see that when people haven't been offered that option of hope.
Do you think that part of the problem is short-termism? People don't want to give up anything. They don't want to pay for anything in the short term for long-term benefit.
I think the short-termism problem rests entirely in our politics, with politicians who, particularly we've had ministers changing every year in many government departments. We've had people just going out for the quick win so that they can wave a headline on the front of the newspaper tomorrow. So we haven't had any long-term thinking in government from a very long time. And we absolutely need that. But we also need the understanding that for everybody, the cleanest, greenest, but best possible energy you can use and the cheapest is the energy that you don't need to use. And things like insulating our homes, like providing public transport, active transport options, all of those things are ways of improving people's lives, actually tackling the cost of living crisis. The fact that we haven't had onshore wind and solar is now putting £200 a year on the average energy bill right at this moment. So it's the cost of the living crisis is in part a function of the failure to deliver the green transition over the past couple of decades.
Yeah, and the best power, surely, is the power that you don't actually have to create, you just take, and that would be solar and wind. And the Labour government, the brand new Labour government, have unveiled plans for what they call a rooftop revolution. They are going to go full on trying to get people to install solar panels on their roofs. What do you make of what you've read from their plans so far?
Absolutely welcome that. Rooftops are entirely the right place for solar panels to be. And it's a great tragedy that this could have happened nearly a decade ago. There was the net zero home standard, which was announced in 2006, was going to come in 2016. And at the absolute last minute, the Cameron Tory government just threw that out, which really left many of the better, more organised, more focused building companies absolutely with their heads in their hands in despair, because changing the rules midstream is a disaster. And we also saw, of course, the Cameron government's pull the rug out from underneath a whole industry of small businesses up and down the country that was installing solar panels on people's roofs with the feed-in tariff. So what we've had is seesawing policies over the past decade and more. What we need now, and what we will hopefully be seeing, and certainly the new 4 Green MPs and the 2 Greens in the House of Lords will be pushing the government for consistent long-term focus on stable policies, which is what we need for the energy transition.
And what do you make of the plans for these mega solar farm sites? There's been 3 announced, and also the onshore windmill sites, because people tend to not like change round where they live. So there will be a certain pushback, won't there?
Well, particularly, very much welcome the onshore wind, and it with solar is the cheapest form of electricity generation we can have. What we in the Greens have long been focusing on, and indeed we got considerable support in the House of Lords for it under the previous government, but unfortunately they resisted. We want to see far more community ownership of wind farms, particularly onshore wind farms in particular. And if a community can decide for themselves that this is our community wind farm, is our community wind turbine, we're going to decide where to put it, we're going to enjoy the benefits from this, we can invest in it. If you have that sense of ownership, there's very good evidence that people are very keen on that. And in terms of the solar farms, I think there's understandable resistance because it does mean changing the look of the countryside. But it is worth looking at the history of this. Is if you go back 150 years or so ago, about a third of our land was given over to energy generation. That was when we relied on literally horsepower. It was growing hay and oats for horses. And so the idea of using land for energy generation is not actually a new idea. What's really important is that they're put in the right place, that they're actually managed in the right way so that you've got the maximum biodiversity gain, which is perfectly possible with hedges, with underplanting of the right plants. You can also have some food production, perhaps with grazing sheep. It's a question of installing them in the right way, in the right form, with the consent of local communities.
And just finally, on the subject of the Green Party itself, you've done particularly well in the last election, for which many congratulations. But given that climate change is probably the most serious crisis facing humankind, is it not a little disappointing that you didn't do better?
I think a 400% increase is really not something that could be described as disappointing. And I think you have to look at this in the broader context of over the last 5 years, the number of Green councillors across the England and Wales has gone up fivefold. We're coming into the county council elections next May when we'll be looking to have another big increase in the number of Green councillors. We have a graph of exponential growth of those councillors. We're aiming for the same kind of growth in terms of the number of Green MPs. But even without that, we know that Caroline Lucas had a huge impact as one Green MP. I have no doubt that our 4 wonderful new Green MPs will have an enormous impact in the debate, in the discussion. We're really winning these arguments. It's so obvious that we need to take action that will tackle the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis together. We've got to think about plastics. I was just looking at a question I'll be putting to the new government about the Global Plastics Treaty. Will they be pushing for the strongest possible of that when we're getting more and more evidence every day of the public health risk microplastics present to all of us? When we're thinking about factory farming, the impact that's having on our rivers, the quality of life or non-life in our rivers and the health of all of us, all of these things are really at a crunch point. And even just 4 Green MPs, I have no doubt, will be absolutely bringing those front and centre and winning the arguments on these issues and pulling people in the right direction.
Well, I certainly hope so. Thanks very much for your time, Natalie. That's Green Party peer, Baroness Natalie Bennett. So what do you think of this court case in Southwark Crown Court? 5 Just Stop Oil activists were convicted for conspiring to cause gridlock, essentially holding up traffic. They were not, according to the reports, allowed to present their case to the jury. In other words, they weren't allowed, as has been the case in other cases, to tell the jury why it was they did what they did. The judge ruled it immaterial, which is kind of strange. The judge also said that these 5 people who held up traffic in order to highlight the problems is too light a word, the imminent perhaps catastrophe, as it has been described by most climate scientists, that them doing that is going to win them a lengthy jail sentence. Now, at a time when our jails are reportedly full, so full that the Conservative administration released 10,000 prisoners early, and the Labour Party is going to have to do the same again, are these the kind of people we should be putting in jail? The UN rapporteur for environmental defenders, a chap called Michael Forst, was watching the proceedings in Southwark Crown Court, and he claimed that he had not seen anything like it in any country. He witnessed 3 of the 5 defendants being arrested in court, dragged to the cells, protesters outside attempting to warn jurors that they were not hearing the full case, and a judge just desperately trying to maintain control over his courtroom. Maybe that informed the judge's decision. We don't know what their sentence is going to be, but he has indicated that these 5 people who stopped traffic on the M25 in November 2022 are facing long jail sentences. Are these the people that should be being sent to jail? Stanwell. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Nick. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Okay, yeah, no, I think it's absolutely disgusting. We've had the right to protest and peacefully, which they were, causing people inconvenience and whatever else is not good. But it's as you already highlighted, it brings it to the attention of people, and for a judge to actually dismiss people's right to actually speak in a court, I think it shows how far we have gone down the rabbit hole of people being paid by these huge companies, and it runs deep. Obviously, that a judge will allow that to happen.
It seems that this is a hangover from the previous Conservative administration. It doesn't smell right that this would have happened had the Labour Party been in charge in November 2022 or during the course of this Crown Court case. So perhaps the judge will be directed otherwise. I'm not sure what the government can actually do about this.
Well, the thing is, I'm sure they can, put a bill forward to reverse the draconian measures that the Conservative Party put in place. Because we know that, and as the Baroness was speaking to before I came on, she spoke a lot of sense, and I'd have to agree that we have to take away the money from donors that have interests in things that are creating problems for the planet and people to live normally.
Yeah. The Tories apparently accepted £8.4 million from oil and gas interests and polluting industries and individuals who supported climate change science denial, £8.4 million since 2019. And the Conservative Party and its MPs received 80 times more polluting cash than the Liberal Democrats and 160 times more than the Labour Party. And I suppose money talks.
Exactly. And what you have to watch out for is that the new government don't get hungry the same way the last government got. And there needs to be a body that controls that. We need to have a system that regulates how much money is received by individual candidates or individual MPs from wherever, that we can control the influence that these bodies and these corporations have on our countries, and the quicker that happens, the quicker we can get a government. I'm hoping the Labour government do it. Say, hold up, it's not right how much influence these people have, these corporations have over our governments, and they shouldn't have the influence. They shouldn't have the ability to control the media and give so much money that certain parties can put out so much more information in favour of certain parties.
Propaganda.
Exactly. And the quicker that happens, the quicker there is a limit. And there shouldn't even be a limit. There should be none
at all.
Influence.
I agree entirely. Yes, it's about time that the government of this country was run for the benefit of the people rather than for the benefit of the people who run this country. Thank you, Michael. Oh, look, Michael to Mike, East Yorkshire. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Nick. Yeah, I just want to contrast what happened in Southwark with something else. And if you think back to when the statue of the slaver was pulled down and thrown in the dock, the people who did it were allowed to explain their case in court, and they were acquitted. Now, what we've got in Southwark is people not being allowed to explain why they've done something. And this is extremely authoritarian and worrying, because you can get a completely different result. Now, if they were allowed to explain in the Southwark court why they did what they did, and they were found guilty, fair enough. But all the right-wingers and the people who...
Climate science deniers.
And everything else at the time, they want to suppress that particular thing, but they're also going on about freedom of speech. Everyone should be allowed total freedom of speech, and like it didn't suit them. and then they're not allowed to speak and explain why they've done something. It's really authoritarian and disturbing, Nick.
Yes, it's much like those politicians who were, well, one of which was speaking today, who has always railed against cancel culture and then demanded that a comedian that made a joke about him be cancelled.
Yeah, and it's like the National Trust. Yeah, they're not allowed to explain where the wealth came from that created these great estates and great houses.
Yeah, ridiculous.
Which you can look at.
It's just
and
history. Yeah. It's not rewriting history, it's writing history. Yeah. Mike, thanks for that. Let's see. Texts and emails. Albert says environmentalists cause more pollution, blocking traffic. I understand they're concerned about pollution, but they are just adding to it if they stopped and thought about it. Yeah, that's the definition of short-termism, though, Albert. They may be creating more pollution in that moment for an hour or so, but what they're trying to do is to stop year after year after year of pollution that will, if these scientists are right, and it's about 99% of those who look into this, then the future for humankind is pretty bleak, really, because if the climate changes and we aren't attuned to it, we're not used to it, we won't be able to change fast enough in order to accommodate those changes. I mean, imagine if the sea level rose by 5 feet. That would impact every city by a body of water, which is pretty much every city in the world. I mean, the trial, the prosecution was talking about £750 million of economic damage from stopping traffic. But you can multiply that by billions, trillions, to try to fix a problem that will be caused by climate change. So spend a bit, what's the phrase about stitches? A stitch in time saves 9. I think that's how that goes.